So welcome to my talk. I appreciate it. I was like, you guys got in here a little late, so I was a little worried if anybody was actually going to come and hang out with me, because this is the Better Software Conference, and this is a talk about some applications of software or Agile outside of IT. So what I'd love to do is just to get a sense for why you guys came to this talk, and then what I'll do is I'll tell you a little bit about what we're going to do just to kind of level set everybody's expectations. So anybody brave want to share with me? Like what's your application for Agile outside of IT?
I don't know, I've heard about people doing it with their families, and I don't know, I'm just very interested in what direction I'm going to take with this course.
Okay, cool. So you're just here to kind of explore? Yeah, okay, awesome. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am? For parenting? Okay, fascinating, because that's not the angle that I'm planning to take this, so we'll see how it goes. Yeah, okay, excellent. Yeah, go ahead.
I come from the aerospace background.
Okay.
So we deliver hardware and software for military aircrafts. And the hardware guys typically go, you can't do that.
Okay, so that's closer to the direction we're going to take this one here today. Okay, cool. Anybody else? Anybody brave? No? Yeah? Okay, cool. Yeah, please. Process? Okay, cool. So I'll tell you guys a little bit about me. So that's my little interest slide. I always like to put up a picture of me dressed like a grown-up, because I don't always do that. So a little bit about my history. So I grew up in IT and got my early Agile experience with a company called CheckFree, and we were doing like online banking and bill payment stuff. And so from the earliest days in my experience with Agile, it was never really about like small team Agile and co-location, right? That wasn't what we were really going for. What we were dealing with were large-scale systems of systems. Okay, so that's kind of my background, and that was my early entry into Agile. And then I had a really cool experience after doing that for a couple years. I got to go work for version 1, who in a year or two, I'm not even gonna be able to say that anymore because they're CollabNet now. And so I was working for version 1, and what was really cool and formative for me during that period of my career is that I got to go into about 150, 200 different companies during that time and experience what people were doing with Agile. And so it was almost like getting like a master's degree or a doctorate in, not only how to do it well, but like also how to like goof things up, like what things kind of made it hard. And one of the things that I would get really frustrated about during that time is that what we were doing a lot of was teaching people how to do Agile and instrumenting Agile into organizations that weren't really set up or built to do Agile. Do anybody in your companies just feel like it's hard to make it work because you're just not wired for it, right? And so about 8 years ago now, almost exactly 8 years ago, I started LeadingAgile, which is my consulting firm, and we're based in Atlanta, Georgia. And what we do is we go into some pretty large companies sometimes and help them make the changes within the organization in order to be able to take advantage of Agile methodologies. And so we'll talk a little bit about that here today, but it's like it really comes down to, if you can't form like complete cross-functional teams, it's really difficult to do Scrum, okay? If you can't work with your business partners to get a backlog, it's really hard to establish a stable velocity. And I think a lot of times we talk about Agile like, if I teach you the practices, then it will show you your impediments and then you'll fix them, right? And you'll be able to do good Scrum. Well, sometimes in some contexts, that's like really, really difficult. Okay? And so as we've been around for a while, over the last couple years, we had a couple of interesting phone calls where somebody in a totally non-IT context says, hey, we've heard about the Scrum thing, can you guys come in and teach us Scrum? Okay? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of build an explicit kind of way of talking about this, and like how we kind of handled those phone calls, what we did with these clients, and then like what patterns that we kind of derived out of it. Because what we found is that just teaching them Scrum wasn't going to be able to be effective. So I'm going to probably spend the first third of the talk. I like to break things into threes. I don't know why. It's something I've picked up. And so the first talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem, and I'm going to get up underneath it, and I'm going to see if it resonates with you. Okay? And then the next piece is I'm going to explore how we approached applying Agile into some of these non-IT contexts. And then you guys, I'm kind of curious if you guys think it resonates with you, right? If you think there's something to extract. And then the third thing is we're going to kind of walk through 2 case studies and 2 specific kind of implementations. One that was kind of like a marriage, a little bit of like waterfall and Agile, and then there was another one that's kind of more like a lean design thinking and Agile kind of a thing, okay? So normally when I get up and talk, I usually almost like present like an expert and I go, oh, Agile transformation, right? Agile this, Agile that, right? And I'm kind of approaching it from the standpoint of, hey, this is the way you should do things. This is a little bit more exploratory. I'm like kind of offering an idea to the community and to kind of get feedback, right? So if it's useful to you, use it. If it's not, then, then cool, right? So the setup, and I apologize for all the text on this, but it's like, this isn't a talk I do a ton, and it is very idea and kind of word oriented. So the first example was with a hotel chain that's based in Atlanta, Georgia. And what they were doing basically was they're going through a major rebranding effort. So the work that they wanted to apply Scrum to was things like getting case goods in and redoing tile and choosing colors and actually doing the work necessary to actually move a physical hotel that you would sleep in into kind of this new branding model that they wanted to do. Does that make sense? Okay? And so you imagine that's a really interesting application for Scrum, right? Like how would you even do that, right? And then so the second one was a fast food restaurant that gave us a call. And we still work with this one a little bit here and there. And they're really interested in Agile. And as you might imagine, like most companies, they do a fair amount of software. And they do Agile in a traditional software context. But they also have a lot of interest in being able to apply Agile into things like supply chain management or new product development, things like burgers or chicken sandwiches or whatever, right? How do they refactor their kitchens to put more equipment into the same footprint? How do they redesign kitchen fryers so that they take up a smaller space without changing the nature of the food? Okay? And you think about it, and you gotta go, well, how would I apply Scrum to that, right? It's a really fascinating thing. And so I think that there's some stuff, right? But the pattern that we're getting is that people that are considering, they've heard about the benefits of Agile in software. They know somebody that's doing Agile in software. And so they call up and they want to do Agile, but they usually ask for Scrum training. Okay, does that make sense? So that's kind of like the pattern. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we kind of begin to break this down. And when I was putting together this talk, I did this talk at Agile 2017 last year for the first time. And again, it's not one that I do a ton, and I was actually surprised this conference accepted it. So it's kind of fascinating. So, but when I was putting the talk together, I happened to be connected with Alistair on Facebook, as I imagine like a lot of us are. And Alistair's a fascinating guy to me because he's a signer of the manifesto, really kind of cool, eccentric fellow. And he puts up stuff on his Facebook page, from the early history and the methodology work that he was doing. And sometimes he's talking about really tough like program portfolio management and methodology, and sometimes he's talking about hard Agile, right? So he's all over the place. But one of the things that I thought was fascinating, I asked his permission to kind of quasi quote him on this, is one of the things that he was talking about is that Agile is just an ordinary word in English. It means to be able to move quickly and easily. And then he goes and he starts talking about the history of the manifesto, and was talking about how, once this group of 17 people had the word in place, they were basically just trying to figure out what it meant for the purposes of writing software, and then parenthetically, more generally for the purposes of designing products. They selected 4 values or ways to center ourselves in the world. Those values ended up in the manifesto. Okay, and it's a little passé to me at this point to start off talks on Agile with talks about the Agile Manifesto, and I don't usually like to do that, but I think it's particularly relevant here. And I got 2 Scrum trainers sitting in the front of the room, right? So I'm going to pick on Scrum just a little bit. One of the things that's fascinating to me about Scrum, and you see it, and I see this in practice every day, is that there was a set of values and principles. Right, so actually just a brief kind of like history lesson, right? So what was happening is all the methodologies were emerging. All the early methodologies in Agile were emerging in the 90s. And then in 2001, the people that were doing the methodologies got together and came and said, this is what they have in common, right? So the Agile stuff, the manifesto, was actually derived from what people were doing. Okay? And so back in those days, we were talking about small teams, co-located, on-site customers, putting together working tested software on regular intervals. And a couple of different things happened over time, right? I think the emergence of the CSM certification happened, where you could go and you could learn about Scrum over a period of 2 days. And what ended up kind of manifesting itself in market, in my opinion, was this distillation of this rich body of knowledge around how we organize things, how we get value identified, and it got codified into a set of roles and practices and artifacts. And what happens is that people who aren't expert at it, they naively think that they can take those roles and practices and artifacts and apply them, and they'll get the magic. And what I believe is that the magic is actually deeper than just doing daily stand-up meetings, deeper than doing reviews and retrospectives, deeper than having a Scrum Master. Right? Those things are awesome enabling practices around this kind of ecosystem. Okay? So a lot of times when I'm starting off this conversation with somebody, I have to kind of go into that, because the conversation you want to have when you're thinking about applying Agile outside of a non-IT domain is really, what is it? Okay, and if you're going to do Scrum as an expression of Agile, you have to have kind of a hypothesis around how those ceremonies are actually going to enable your work. Okay, and so then I'll go into and I'll start talking a little bit about, Agile is really just about people communicating and people collaborating. The idea of us working together over managing our relationships between processes and tools and handoffs and governance and things like that. Working software over comprehensive documentation. When I was first kind of wrestling that around in my head and back in the early 2000s, what I was really thinking about is it's really more about measurable progress over artifacts. So whatever it is we're doing, we want to prioritize for validating progress with actually what the unit of value is. Okay, whether you're in marketing or sales or what have you, or you're building, new chicken fryers, right? We have to have some way of thinking about what is a measurable unit of progress. Okay, and that's going to be really key for the rest of the conversation. So customer collaboration over contract negotiation. We understand that our knowledge of the solution we're trying to build is imperfect, so we want to create collaborative ecosystems to make sure that we can inspect and adapt as we go. And then the other thing is we want to create plans that are resilient to change. And so it's not that we don't plan, it's that we want to create plans that we can easily change when we learn something new. Okay? And the reason why, again, with this crowd that I wanted to anchor on that is because those things become incredibly important when we start talking about how to change and adapt Agile or change and adapt Scrum to deliver against our particular context. Does that make sense? Okay? So let's break down Scrum, right? So the idea is if we're going to apply Scrum, we have to understand what its kind of conceptual operating model is. Okay? So Scrum, right, when somebody calls me up and says, hey, we want to use Scrum in these really complex non-IT domains, right, it's the product owner, it's the Scrum Master, it's the team, it's the sprint planning, daily stand-up reviews and retrospectives, backlog, product increments, things like that. Okay? So Scrum's a very specific instantiation of Agile. Okay? There's some things that it requires for you to be successful that I'm going to go to in the next slide sequence. But if you don't create the right ecosystem for Scrum to thrive, those roles, ceremonies, and artifacts won't necessarily work for you. My kid, I was just telling, we were talking with Anu about Dave Pryor's a CST that works with me at LeadingAgile, and my 16-year-old's interning with me over the summer, which is kind of fun. And we sent him to Dave's CSM class, right? So my 16-year-old's sitting in a CSM class with all these grown-ups that are in software, and he's pretty new, right? So he came home with a copy of the Scrum Guide. And it said, I can't remember what's on the front of the Scrum Guide, but it said something about playing the game of Scrum, right? The rules of playing the game of Scrum, right? Yeah. And the reason why I think that's relevant is because Scrum requires, right, if you think about the rules of chess or the rules of anything, right, chess requires a board, it requires certain pieces, right, it requires a framework, a set of agreements. And a lot of times what we do is we get into Scrum and we're using the rules of Scrum and we're playing the game of Scrum, but we don't really have the board set up right. So a big part of what we're going to explore is if you're going to do Scrum, you got to figure out, can you create the playing board that Scrum's designed to be played on? Because the rules of chess don't work if you don't have all the right pieces and the board's not the right dimensions and all that kind of stuff, right? And so the other thing that I just kind of want to point out before we go into it is that when we start talking about the scaled Agile methodologies, we see a lot of traction in that as well in market right now too. Each of those methodologies require a context as well. So like a big part of like what I write and speak about and think about and we consult around is how do you get the practices, the methodology that you want to apply congruent with the organization that you're in. Because a lot of times you've got two choices. You either have to change the methodology to accommodate the organization or you have to change the organization to accommodate the methodology. And there's always a set of trade-offs that go there, right? So just be aware, right? When you decide to apply Scrum, there's a particular context that we're going to explore that Scrum works in. If you were considering using SAFe, SAFe's a great methodology, right? It has a context that it's trying to be applied within. You know, multiple or like a single value stream, multiple teams, probably dependencies within them. You got to be able to get everybody into kind of big room planning, and you got to be able to go through these different steps, right? You got to do that to make SAFe work. Large scale Scrum's interesting because the LESS methodology, if you've heard of that, really requires encapsulated independent teams that can continuously deliver, lightweight coordination between them. You know, so again, right, there's a methodology, but then there's an ecosystem that causes that methodology to work. Same with DAD, same with Nexus. Okay? So the anchor for me, if I'm going to apply Agile methodologies, and I use the word methodologies very specifically, if I'm going to apply Agile methodologies or Scrum specifically, there's three things that I think are absolutely non-negotiable. And the first time I did this, it was, I think, Daniel Gullo who invited me to speak at a Scrum gathering here in Vegas, as I recall, a couple years back. And so I did this talk called The Three Things That You Need to Transform Any Size Organization. And this has been a core of kind of my consulting hypothesis and a lot of the speaking that I do. And I want to get people really clear on how to build these ecosystems. And so the three things that we talk about are the idea of backlogs, teams, and working tested software. And so my hypothesis is that there's nothing in Scrum that will work if you don't have the ability to create these three sets of preconditions. Okay? And so for me, a backlog is a list of maybe requirements or items of business value that you want to be able to put into the product. Okay? So in software, that has a very specific formula, very specific kind of context that you can provide. But the idea is that it's kind of a stack ranked list, and you start on the top and you start working through it. And you can sit down with your product owner and you can explore what done looks like. You want them to be small enough that you can build a couple of them in the course of a day or two. You want to be able to get measurable, demonstrable progress throughout the sprint planning, right? All that kind of stuff, right? So the backlog has a very specific construct. And what's fascinating is when we go in to teach IT teams how to do Scrum, what we find is it's really, really difficult for a lot of IT teams to be able to get the right kind of backlog. Tons of teams have like this thematic list, high-level stuff, right? It doesn't meet the requirements, okay? The second thing that you really need to do fundamentally to do Scrum is you need to have a complete cross-functional team, a team that can work together within the sprint and self-organize to move the work through the queue. Okay? One of the big things that we see in the problems of like forming teams is that teams are transient or people are part-time on them, or, and this is the biggest thing, even if you get teams right, they tend to have a lot of dependencies between them. Anybody deal with dependencies in their organizations? Right? So dependencies kind of kill Agile teams. Okay? Now we know dependencies exist, right? So I'm not saying that they don't exist, but they bend your ability to do Agile. Because when a team doesn't have everything and everyone necessary to be able to deliver its increment, or has to coordinate with a bunch of groups outside of it, it's really hard for that team to own and self-organize around the outcome. Okay? So they tend to go through a lot of the motions of doing Scrum, but they can't get to that holy grail of third component, which is working tested software, or more generally like a validatable increment of the product, right? Something that the customer can actually look at. Okay, so when I got involved in doing Agile 15 years or so ago now, I came out of project management, probably like a lot of us. And one of the big challenges that I was always asking myself and the team is, how do I know when we're going to be done? Is that a reasonable question? Do you guys get asked that question periodically? I walk into some organizations and they'll say, like, how do I get my managers to stop asking me for due dates? I look at them and I go, is that realistic? I mean, do you really think people are going to like not let you have some sort of due date? Right? Well, in Agile's based really, to me, and this is probably going to be oversimplistic, is basically managing the triple constraints. If you think about a sprint is a fixed duration, right? That's time. If the team is stable and stays together, that's cost. So what we're doing in Agile is we're fixing time and we're fixing cost, and we're strategically varying scope to be able to achieve objectives. And so if you want to know when something's going to be done, what you have to know is you have to know the size of the backlog, you have to know the velocity of the team, and then based upon the size of the backlog and the velocity of the team, you can begin to derive either how long it's going to take to move through the backlog, right, the number of sprints it's going to take, or if you've got a fixed number of sprints to deliver, the amount of work that you're going to be able to get done in those sprints. Okay? So to me, if we're answering the question of when are we going to be done, what are we going to get, how much is it going to cost, how long is it going to take, right, that kind of stuff, then we have to be able to understand these variables. And what we find in practice is that with folks that are new to Scrum or just trying to really early introduce it, if I can't get a team that can stabilize velocity, I don't know where, excuse me, I'm going to grab a glass of water. I don't know where I'm at against the backlog. If I don't have my backlog well identified to the point that I can estimate it on any given horizon, I don't really know how much work there is to do. Okay? And if I can't get to a definition of done at the end of the sprint, then I risk that there's this indeterminate pile of work that's building up in the back that I don't have any visibility into. It could be technical debt, it could be defects, it could be unfinished requirements, things like that. Okay? And so if we want to do a more structured, kind of predictable version of Scrum, then we need to have these variables. Totally possible. If dates literally don't matter and you're in a lean startup and it's really totally cool to just absolutely explore, then those rules don't apply. But for most people that are trying to adopt Agile, especially in non-IT stuff, some notional idea of when we're going to be done is really important. Okay? It's important to me to introduce that idea to you because if we start going through the motions of Scrum, and we don't have some sort of non-IT analog for what a team is, and we don't have a non-IT analog for what a backlog is, or what does it mean to get to a quantifiable measure of value, right? The ceremonies, roles, and artifacts of Scrum aren't going to make a lot of sense for us. I would suggest that the values and principles of the manifesto would probably still make sense. But if we're going to choose to use Scrum, we have to figure out what those three things mean to us. So I'm going to pause for a second. Any questions on like where I'm taking the group at this point? No? You guys good? You absorbing it all? Getting it in? Okay, cool. So opportunities and challenges, right? So there's some, if we want to try to apply Agile, we want to try to apply Scrum into a non-IT context, there's kind of an upside and there's kind of a downside. And the upside is we can get clarity, we can get accountability, we can get measurable progress. Big fan of Dan Pink's drive, autonomy, mastery, and purpose. One of the things I don't think we talk about enough in Scrum, and I often when I'm doing like the big three things talk, I'll really link it explicitly. But the idea of a team, right, that gives us the ability to own something. right? The ability to have autonomy, not to have to coordinate with everybody. Dependencies get in the way of that. Definition of done is mastery. We get to say this was finished, right? We get to be able to claim victory. Purpose, the backlog is ties us to the objectives of the organization. And one of the things that's kind of neat is that it's kind of neat and bad at the same time. Dan Pink's hypothesis in his book Drive is that if we have autonomy, mastery, and purpose, it gives us kind of meaning for coming to work. We only work for, we want to get paid fairly and we want to have enough to take care of our families. But at the end of the day, right, we want autonomy, mastery, and purpose, right? That's kind of the point of his book. and it's really pretty straightforward to tie teams, backlogs, working tested software, and what we're trying to do in Scrum to this autonomy, mastery, purpose idea. And so it's really pretty powerful when you link it to just kind of human nature and what we're trying to do as knowledge workers. The other side, the dark side of it, is when we don't do those things, right? We don't give people autonomy, mastery, and purpose, and we begin to struggle, okay? And so autonomy, mastery, purpose, transparency, trust, collaboration. And this is where we start to get into thinking about how to apply Agile and Scrum into non-IT contexts. Because what you find is when you're dealing with physical goods, where there's lag in lead times, when you're dealing with trucks moving things around, or hardware that has to be merged maybe with software, or you're dealing with product development in a tangible world, right, prototypes and things. It's really difficult. Like, what are we going to form a team around? Okay, what would that look like for a team to be autonomous and have the ability to produce something of value at the end of the sprint? Not saying it's impossible in maybe like a small design team, but in these complex things that we're trying to do, right, case goods into a rebranded hotel at the right time, the trucks have to arrive and the designs have to be done and the sign-offs have to happen and the lead times have to occur, right? What does it mean to get to the end of the delivery at the end of the sprint? What does it mean when backlogs are emergent? Like, we have to figure out how to deliver on time. But what we don't really have is we don't really have an idea of what the backlog is. Sometimes these decisions are being made continuously as we go. Non-agile partners in your supply chain. Okay, that's like a classic software waterfall, agile waterfall kind of a thing. But if you've got non-agile partners in your supply chain, what do you do with that? Okay, external dependencies, and then absolutely hard dates. Okay, so what we're doing is we're starting to build a conceptual argument for how do we get the benefits of the manifesto, how do we leverage the practices in Scrum or even some of the other Agile frameworks, understanding that the ecosystem necessary to sustain those doesn't necessarily exist. You guys with me on the problem so far? Okay, cool. We're building up. Well, this is what I find. I actually have started telling people this is a lot of times I've got like one really, what I think is a cool idea in my talk, but it takes me 55 minutes to like set the groundwork, and then I can tell you the idea, and you'll go, oh, that's awesome, right? But if I hadn't spent the first 55 minutes like building up the mental models for it, my idea wouldn't make any sense to you. So that's what we're doing. We're building a mental model with you guys right now. And hopefully it will pay off in the last 5 or 10 minutes, probably sooner than later. All right, so kind of what we just talked about. Create a system and delivery that allows some of the benefits of Agile, maybe most of the benefits of Agile, while respecting the necessary constraints of the organization around us. Okay, so that's the key. Respecting the necessary constraints of the organization around us. I have a whole company that is based upon the notional idea that we can remove those constraints in software organizations. Can't always, but a lot of times we can. In non-IT contexts, large-scale physical goods, some of those constraints are necessary, and we can't pretend they don't exist. Okay? And this is the key insight, and I apologize, I just want to apologize for the slide, but schedules, milestones, and budgets establish constraints within which decisions and trade-offs are made. And I'm going to say top-level plans can be flow-based or schedule-based. So what we observe is that I'm just going to say this in shorthand, project plans are often necessary and required. Okay? So that's a set of constraints Okay? And most projects operate within constraints. One of my favorite quotes was, and this is starting to be 20 years old now at this point, when George Lucas re-released all the Star Wars movies. One of the greatest quotes he ever said is he goes, great movies are never finished, they're only abandoned. You remember he like changed the movies at one point, he got an opportunity to come back and do it, right? So there's deadlines. I've got to be in market. I only have so much money. I've got to get all the marketing and everything around it, and it's got to be in the theaters on a certain day, right? So there's this top level that's constraints, okay? It can be plan-driven constraints, or they can be flow-based constraints or investment constraints. And this is really key to what we're getting ready to talk about. Prioritizing, sequencing, and validating decisions is the effort of a cross-functional collaborative team. Decisions are informed and constrained by the top-level plan. Decisions are the currency of delivery. So I'm going to tell you what I mean by that. In any given project, and I would say this is probably true of IT projects as well, but especially non-IT projects, there is a plan. The problem that we have in delivering against those plans is just the same problem we have in software, is that our understanding of the work that needs to be done is imperfect. Okay? And the problem is that because it's imperfect, and when we have a more waterfall or sequential kind of metaphor for doing the work, the feedback loops and the latency periods in decision making is too long. Okay? And so what we want to do is we want to amplify and increase collaboration where decisions get made, where requirements are defined. As our emerging understanding of what it is that we're building is revealed to us, we want to use that to inform not only the execution on the ground, but also what the top level plan is. And so this idea that decisions are the currency of delivery, when we start getting into this a little bit more, what I'm going to propose, I'm hypothesizing with you, is that decisions are kind of the backlog of the Agile team. Okay? So Agile really lives in the decision-making layer rather than in the execution layer. And then execution can be managed using Agile, iterative, and incremental, or plan-driven models. Deliverables are measured and assessed against the near-term milestones. So you have a set of constraints, you have a continuous flow of decisions, and then you've got the people on the ground that are doing the work. They're driving trucks, they're moving stuff around, they're hauling crap between one place and another, right? They're building a piece, they're doing something, right? And so their actual execution on the ground and their actual progress, whatever methodology that they're using, right, is going to inform the decision-making process. Okay? And then the last line is that feedback loops link the various levels of planning to provide feedback against portfolio objectives. Okay? So I'm going to give you guys a visual on that, right? Because I know that's a lot of words and that's a lot of big thoughts. Okay? So the model is basically this. Establish constraints at the top layer, and especially if you're doing aerospace or something like that, you're going to have Gantt charts, right? You're gonna have plans, you're gonna have stuff that links together. Okay, so as an aspiring Agilist in that kind of context, like, let's just not fight that battle. Okay? What we want to do is we want to have a really solid mechanism for collaborating, responding to change, respecting people, getting feedback, right? All the things in the manifesto. Okay? So the top level is constraints. The middle layer is a decision-making queue, and then the lowest layer is just executing kind of however we try to get there. Okay? So I'm going to show you guys two models that we kind of walk through. One's based on more of a waterfall style governance, and one's based on more of kind of a design thinking style governance. Right? So the first one, the model that we put together, this is for the hotel chain doing the case goods, right? What was really hard with those guys was figuring out what the unit of value was that they were trying to move forward. And if you really think about it, the unit of value, the thing that they could make money off of, was a converted hotel. Okay, because that's when we go from old brand, go to new brand, people can sleep in it. And one of the things that's really fascinating is I have a friend that that owns a franchise of a pretty major national chain restaurant, and it was really interesting. They were going through a rebranding effort, very similar to this, but in a different context. And the lady plays, like, her kids play lacrosse with my kids, and so we spend a lot of time on the lacrosse field talking. And I think what she does is fascinating. And she was talking about how at the end of 2017, they actually had to save money because they wanted to be able to pay their employees during the rebrand time, right, when the store was going to be closed. That meant that they had to save X number of thousands of dollars, and if they didn't get the rebrand done before the end of the year, that would be taxable income, and then they'd have to go save more money the next year, right? So they had like a real human constraint that they had to be done by the end of 2017 so that they could pay the people with 2017 dollars and then, not have that carry over and get taxed. Okay, so just real life stuff, right? And so, so these hotel operators had very similar kinds of constraints. They were going to be largely out of business, so they wanted to do the rebrands during downtime. They wanted to do it during slow seasons, right? Whatever, that kind of a thing. And so once we identified that the transformed hotel was the unit of value, they also recognized that they had hotel operators that were willing to go to market with maybe less than perfect designs or things that might need to be reworked later, right? So they had hotel operators that were more willing to take risk, and then hotel operators that were less willing to take risk, right? Early adopters versus late adopters, right? Some of the late adopters wanted to see what the other folks were going to do. Right, so this is a real oversimplification, but what we did is we basically sequenced the property and the operators and the case goods and the marketing, right, based upon the nature of the hotel rooms, whether they had ADA compliant rooms, whether they had trundle beds, whether they had suites, whether they had whatever, right? And we used the sequencing, the roadmap of the hotels and all of the other decisions that need to be made, and we kind of like would draw a line through it. And we'd say, okay, this set of decisions needs to be made now, this set of decisions can be made next month, this set of decisions can be made the month after that. So what we did is we used their plans to sequence the decisions that had to be made so that they could get the work flowing through the system, okay? So this at the top was very heavily Gantt chart kind of focused. But the cool thing is that they're really smart people, and they're actually pretty high in the organization. They recognize, and this is where we get in trouble with Gantt charts. It's not that a Gantt chart's bad, it's just that we believe the Gantt chart to be true, right? And if we recognize that it's not true, but represents a set of constraints that we need feedback against, then we can use the Gantt chart for good instead of evil. Right? It's not a stick to beat up the team, right? It's a published artifact of constraints. Okay? And so what we did is we'd figure out what decisions needed to be made. And we created a queue, a backlog of decisions. And what's fascinating is that the cross-functional team that we built was made up of, like, literally architects, designers, case good people, facilities people, and there was about 9 people that represented all of those different groups. They all had teams that they went off and interacted with, but we had this team of people that were authorized to make decisions. Okay? And that was one of their biggest problems at the time, is that all these people were operating using handoffs. And then the architects were like, no, I can't. You've heard this before, right? No, I can't let go any of decisions until I've made all the decisions. And then, the people are like, well, we want to do all the case goods at one time because we need economies of scale, or, it's just really just very similar to what we deal with in software. So what we did is we used the constraints, we created a backlog of decisions, and then we, in effect, operated like a Scrum team, right, on a cadence, daily stand-ups, reviews, retrospectives, all that stuff, but we really kind of did like a Scrumban, right? So we had those decisions in a continuous flow type queue. So these group of people would operate like a Scrum team, meet every day, do daily stand-ups, right, work together, collaborate, but their goal was to get decisions moved across the board as fast as they possibly could, okay? So as those decisions were being made, they would feed the activity queue of all the different groups that they were working with. right? Whether it be the group that they were working with to order the materials from China, or whether it be the trucking companies, or whether it be the project managers that were driving the engagements within the hotels themselves, the marketing and brand teams, right? So you think about the complexity, all the different like non-IT functions that had to go, right? What those guys needed is they didn't need like a big overall plan. They needed clarity on what to go do. And they could receive that in smaller batches. And we didn't care how they managed their work, right? They just basically had to get this stuff done, right? And so what would happen is that as these guys did the activities in Scrum or Waterfall or just showing up, right? Work orders, right? What have you. Their progress would feed back to the team that was making the decisions about prioritization and sequencing. And then the team that was making decisions about prioritization and sequencing would go back and inform the waterfall Gantt chart set of constraints. So we could prioritize decisions based upon risk and everything up here. The execution would then inform the decisions. And then if the plans had to change, this group was the one that communicated changes to the Gantt chart. Okay? So the thing that was most like Scrum or Agile, right, was this middle tier, right? You know what, people and interactions over processes and tools, right? All those people were sitting in a room, things up on the whiteboard, Kanban boards, blue tape, sticky notes, flip chart paper, right? Very agile in the way that it looked. Working software over comprehensive documentation. They were able to get decisions made in real time so that we could free these guys up to go do the work, right? And we didn't get into decision paralysis. Contract negotiation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, right? They weren't trying to define everything with the case good providers up front. They were trying to make just enough decisions to get prototypes back, collaborating with the people out in the field, right? The ability to respond to change over following a plan, right? So they were able to get the heart and soul of Agile, leverage some of the stuff from Scrum and Kanban in the middle tier, maybe even leverage some Scrum techniques down at the execution level, right? But then, you know, without being dogmatic about process or process framework, achieve the manifesto goals and achieve some agility. Right? And what was cool is we were able to get them like unlocked. It was really that decision-making layer that's always the problem, is bringing people to the table to decide. Make sense? Yeah, please.
I'm curious because we had to do a similar thing.
Yeah.
Look at a Gantt chart for purposes of
Yep.
figuring
Yeah.
the see Gantt chart.
Mm-hmm.
And the very nature of the backlog is that it's short-term, sharp-focused,
Mm-hmm.
and long-term, fuzzy-focused.
Yeah.
It's for it to be adjusted as you go.
Yep.
But when you have to do a Gantt chart that shows stop, end, and
Yeah.
everything laid out as
Yeah.
a thing, I mean, for the most part, the near-term stuff we lay out by priority, and long-term stuff we lay out in the appearance of a logical order.
Yeah.
So we keep them.
Well, so what we had to do here, and obviously I don't know the specifics of your situation, but there's a couple of key things that you have to negotiate with the organization, is that they have to recognize that the plan is a set of constraints, okay? And they have to be able to recognize that the plan's gonna change. Okay? The other thing that people have to recognize, and this goes for software or anything, is that the near-term plans we hypothesize are going to be more accurate than the longer-term plans. So there has to be some recognition that the things that we can see today are in finer-grained resolution than things that we can see in the future. And I get it, right? I run a company and I would love to know like what my revenue projections are for the next 3 years and have my people hit it every single time. Doesn't work that way, right? So I can either put my head in the sand and go, this is what I want, and go spend money as if it was gonna happen and then fail. Or I can be smart and I can recognize that as long as the constraints are managed, the decisions are getting made, the work's getting done, and then I have the appropriate feedback loops up the stack so I know exactly where I'm at, then it'll work. But that doesn't mean that the people that are looking at that top level plan are necessarily going to be as rational as we would like them to be.
So there's no alternative than lay down a logical sequence, try to feedback.
Well, so there was art for us in how we constructed that top thing, because remember, right, the unit of value was transformed hotels. Those business owners, right? If you think about a franchisee operator of a hotel, they're a business owner and they have real life constraints. And that's why I use the example of the fast food people that were saving money, right? There's real consequences to missing those dates. Okay, there's real consequences. So in most applications, what this team's responsible for doing is decomposing and prioritizing the work to maximize the chances of this being successful. Okay, because it's our goal, right? As practitioners, our job is to help the business be successful, to help our customers be successful. So we're going to make pragmatic trade-offs in the middle tier based upon the needs of our stakeholders. And then as the work is getting done, we have to put in more resources, we have to do whatever in order to make sure that the flow of that work is adequate. At the point that we can't manage it at the bottom anymore and it's causing our decisions not to be realized fast enough, then we have to let our executives know in a reasonable way that this plan is off track, right? So those hotel operators can go and adjust. Okay, so what we're really talking about is it's pragmatic management, and we have to get everybody in the system to agree that they're not going to just put their head in the sand and hope for the best. Right? This is active, grown-up project management, I believe. Even when I was doing project management in the first middle 10 years of my career, this is just good project management in a lot of ways. Right? I mean, if you get into earned value and some of the more advanced concepts within the PMI model and things, you can find congruence up and down the stack. It's only when we put together these plans and we pretend that they're real and we don't continuously monitor and control them that we get in trouble. That's my take. So it's kind of like a monitoring control mechanism, right? Using some Agile stuff. Okay? You guys with me? All this stuff, for anybody who's taking pictures, we'll have it posted on leadingagile.com probably within 30 minutes of this being up, right? And video, it's getting recorded, so if you want anybody else to see the talk. So case study number 2. Pretty much the same thing, except that the top level governance was not plan driven. Okay, it was more design thinking driven. It was more investment driven. And so the interesting challenge that we had here is that the client that we were working with had gone through a 10-year development cycle to put something on the menu. Okay, and what was interesting about it is they're well, how can we shorten that to where it's faster than 10 years? Okay, that sounds funny when you actually say it, but yeah, no, but you're right. Okay, so how can you get that to go faster than 10 years? Here's the interesting thing, right? So that particular brand is absolutely meticulous about the taste and quality and kind of brand integrity of its food. And so the definition of done is whether the owner liked it and thought it matched their brand identity. It's probably not exactly perfect, but think about that. That's an incredibly imprecise thing. My team deals with it all the time. Well, I'll know it when I see it, or it'll be done when I like it. I mean, it's what does that mean, And the reality is that when it comes to taste and food and things like that, the definition of done is subjective. So one of the things that we kind of teased out as we were trying to figure out what the unit of value is that they didn't necessarily need the design process to be shorter. What they needed to do was more explicitly manage their investments. Okay, to decide how much are we willing to do, how much are we willing to spend, how far are we willing to go in a very explicit way to be able to produce this new menu item. And so the concept that we had is we had kind of this idea of budgets and investments rather than timelines. And so what they would do is very much like a design thinking, lean startup kind of a thing. I have a hypothesis that I can produce a new sandwich for my menu, and I am willing to spend X amount of dollars, apply this team to it for 3 months to validate that hypothesis. So that team works together, right? That token drops down into here. They figure out how they're going to run it through the test kitchen, how they're going to get owner-operators to taste the food, how they're going to get the owners to make decisions, how they're going to engage the populace, right? All those different physical things that have to happen. And so they designed that. And then they broke the process of building a new sandwich into a backlog of decisions. right? Just like what we talked about, okay? And so what they would do is that they would have that 3-month investment increment, okay? They would spend some time understanding and imagining. That would cause it to break down and to turn into backlogs of decisions, right? Those decisions would get built, right? And then as the chicken sandwich became like a real thing, okay, what they would do is that they would then feed back up, right, the progress they were making, and then somewhere along the way, they'd get up here and they would validate whether that sandwich was the right product for them, okay? And then what we did is we put in like a couple gates. It was like, okay, do we want to continue? Right? Because maybe we don't like it, but we think we're getting closer, so therefore we're just going to loop back through, we're going to make another investment, and we're going to continue it. Or we realize that we don't like the product that we're building at all, and we want to pivot and go into a